Today's video contains subject matter that some viewers may find disturbing, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Also, if you have a true scary story you would like to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And of course, thank you. Back in the 80s, my parents were living in Venezuela with my maternal grandparents. But when they found out that my mom was pregnant with their first kid, me, they wanted to make a better life for themselves. So, with my grandparents' encouragement, they moved to the States. They moved around a bit, starting in California, since my dad already had family living there, and then we ended up making our way to Montana, where they eventually settled for good. After I was born, they had my little brother a few years later. So, at the ages of 8 and 3, they took us back to visit Venezuela and meet our grandparents and our other family for the first time. It was a lot of fun from what I remember. There were a lot of cousins around my age, and we all had a blast. We played kickball, and I remember climbing this huge tree in my grandparents' backyard, and I just laid around on the branches, laughing at a few of my younger cousins that couldn't reach us. I remember eating way too many of these little pies that my grandma made herself. They had some kind of fruit glaze inside and were sprinkled with cinnamon on top. I have no idea what she called them, I could never remember, but they were phenomenal. And I really didn't want to leave when we did. After we got back, my parents promised us that we would go at least once a year and even told us maybe when I had asked if we could move there, not having any sense of distance and the difference between a state and a full country move. All I knew was, as a kid, I loved it. Unfortunately, things happened and we weren't able to go back there the next year, but then we did the year after, when my little sister was born. It was just as much fun that year as it was the last time. It would be a few more years before we would be able to go again, but we did have some family come and visit us, which also was a lot of fun. After that, my parents had 2 more kids, and they decided it would be too expensive and not safe to travel with 5 kids and only 2 adults, so we stopped going as a family. I went one more time with just my dad when my paternal grandfather passed away. Of course, it wasn't all for fun, but it was still great seeing some of my family that I had only talked to on the phone or via email. After that, we pretty much stopped going. We went on vacations as a family in the States, but it wasn't the same. I had fun with my siblings, but there was such a strong family connection between all the aunts, uncles, cousins, and traditions that I really hung on to, and I knew that when I was capable to do so, I knew I would be returning on my own. That way, I could do what I wanted, however long I wanted to, while I was there, and that was exactly what I set out to do. In my early 30s, I had completed my college degree and was at a pretty steady job. I was working my way into the position that I wanted. The place I worked for had great pay and benefits, as well as vacation time. And since I didn't have a family or even a significant other at this point, I decided I would make my vacation time useful and go on my Venezuela trip. My closest cousin and one of my best friends, Daniela, was going to be turning 34, so I thought it would make for a great surprise to show up, and then we could all go out and have fun. I talked with my parents about it, as I at least wanted someone to know where I was, and I would prefer having a ride to the airport, and they loved the idea. They helped me with the locations and where the safest areas to stay were. They were adamant that someone would let me stay with them, but I also didn't want to be an unexpected guest, and I still wanted to be able to explore on my own, so I wanted to find a hotel. Then I got it all booked and paid for. The time finally came for my trip, and my parents took me to the airport, but made me stuff some extra things in my case to give to people. It was a little nerve-wracking as I'd never flown alone and I had a layover, so I had to check in, board, do all of it on my own and quickly. But I did it with minimal issue. When I arrived, I got a ride from the airport to the hotel, which was about 45 minutes away, and I checked in as normal. Now, I will say here that I do speak Spanish. I wasn't perfectly fluent at it, but I knew enough that I could hold a conversation, talk to people at the airport, on the bus, tell the receptionist about me, and things like that. I just sometimes get tripped up on less common words or phrases. However, I think I surprise people when they realize that I do speak Spanish, such as the hotel receptionist. She lightened up quite a bit with me when I did, and even gave some great suggestions on places to visit and areas to avoid. As we all do, in the States, I'd been told by both my parents and this lady of certain little areas to stay clear from, as it was typically nothing but trouble. I got to my room, though, and it was beautiful. It had an older theme to it, but was very comfortable to be in. I called my parents once I checked in and decided to freshen up before I went to my cousin's. After a few hours, I made my way over to their place. I was able to get a bus that took me most of the way and then a cab to take me the rest. Just as expected, they were beyond ecstatic to see me. I'm sure part of them was hoping to see the whole family, which I would have loved to have been able to do for them, but we all still enjoyed our time together. We must have sat and talked for hours, going through photos, little trinkets, and memorable times, and then swapping gifts. By then it was already getting late, so I ended up getting dinner for us all, and they gave me a ride back to my hotel after offering to have me stay with them. We all agreed to meet up the next day, and Daniela and I were going to go around the area for some sightseeing. Daniela was up and at my room early the next day, barely giving me enough time to get ready before she yanked me out of my room. We had a great day, though. She took me to an old movie theater and a park that we went to as kids. We were shopping and even went to a nice place to eat. There were so many memories brought back in one day. It was incredible. The next day was her birthday, and after having a celebration with the family, we were going to go out and have some fun. The next day went as planned, too. We had a party at her place, as she was still living with her parents, my aunt and uncle. Then, after they settled in for the night, we headed out. She said she knew a good place that we could go to party, as she had been there plenty of times, and even joked about finding a guy there. When we got there, I was a little surprised by the way it looked, but I trusted Daniela since she said she had been there many times before. It quite honestly looked like a shack with a shoddy extension built onto the side to extend the size of the place. There were a few people standing around outside smoking. It all seemed a little sketch, but upon approaching them, they were all very friendly. Everyone was well-mannered, most spoke Spanish, but also some English, which helped me a bit too. There were a few people there that Daniela knew already, so she introduced me to her friends. We all had a great time, and I tried drinks that I had never heard of or tried in the States, which probably also affected my ability to think clearly, I'm sure. After some time, I felt like I was going to just collapse with how exhausted I was. Somehow, Daniela looked like she still had hours left in her. I didn't want to leave her, but since she seemed to have friends around, I was less worried about it. I told her in order for me to be able to function whatsoever the next day, I was going to have to head back to my hotel. She understood, so I hugged her and headed out the front. One of the older guys out there, old enough to be my father, I'm sure, offered to give me a ride back. He was really nice and didn't give off any weird vibes, but I declined, saying that I didn't want to be a bother and insisted that I would just get a cab. He understood, and he told me to be safe. I continued walking towards the street to see if I could wave down a cab to stop. There were a few that would drive around the area, but you could also call to get one. After waiting a few and with none driving by, I finally called the company and went through to get one. Shortly after, a car pulled up, came to a stop, and I got in. He asked me for the location, and after I told him, he headed off as normal. I was pretty bad at small talk, unless they brought it up, so I just sat there quietly for a few moments. And not long into the drive, however, the driver asked me if I was going to be here long, and if I was there for work or just personal reasons. All this conversation also took place in English. Again, for the most part, people have been very friendly and welcoming, so I didn't find it hard to talk to this guy either. I told him I lived in the US, but I was here visiting family. Then he started asking odd questions, like if I was staying alone or if someone was waiting for me, how long I was going to be there, if I had other plans while I was here, and other more prying questions. Even being under the influence, something didn't seem right. I started making my answers shorter and shorter and kind of looking around to see if I recognized any buildings or landmarks to tell me how close we were. But that's when I noticed that I didn't have a clue where the hell I was. Nothing looked familiar, and there were very few streetlights. Then, he excused himself from the conversation, saying he had a call to take, which is when I noticed that he had an earpiece in. When he took the call, he spoke in Spanish. I was relieved to be done with the conversation, but that didn't really mean that I was out of the conversation. I started hearing some alarming things being talked about, just by my driver, and I pretended to not know what he was saying. As mentioned, my Spanish isn't the best, but I knew enough to understand most of the things he was saying, such as young, American, pretty, small, should be easy, how much, not enough, where should I take her, and similar startling phrases. Again, I was trying to not look afraid, and I took out my phone to start texting everything I could about where we were, what this guy looked like, and what was being said. And that's when I noticed the guy was looking over at my phone to try and see what I was doing. Again, I was just trying to be sly about it all, so I was looking over at him in my peripheral, and I caught a glimpse of something shiny next to him. Almost like it was in his pocket, or belt loop, maybe. I could see a handle sticking out, and it looked like a weapon. I'm pretty sure it was a knife. I quickly tried to send what I already had to Daniela when the car came to a stop. It was at a crossroad and there was some small homes to the side, and I think the conversation with the person on the phone had ended because that's when I noticed he wasn't talking to them anymore. That's when, without looking over at me, he asked me if I knew Spanish. It may have been stupid, but I decided to respond in Spanish. If you let me out of here, you'll never see me again, and I will not tell anyone. We seemed to sit in silence for what seemed like forever, until he finally drove off with me still in the car. At this point, I thought I blew it, and I started dialing 171 when he stopped in front of a building that looked like a hospital or a clinic of some kind. He got out of the car, walked around to my side and opened the door, and then leaned in, saying, "Americans are more trouble anyways." Then he stood up with his hand on his weapon and motioned for me to get out. I quickly darted out of the car and into the building, watching from inside as he got back in and took off. I stood there terrified that he may come back, until someone came around and tapped me on my shoulder. She asked me if I was okay, and I said yes, and asked if I could stay there until my friend picked me up, and she agreed. She looked around outside and seemed a bit hesitant, maybe, so I told her in Spanish, "Please, I just need a safe place. I won't be a bother." And she seemed to understand. She had me sit in the waiting room while I called my cousin. She got my messages, thankfully, and did try calling back, but since my mind was all over the place, I had missed her call. I finally got a hold of her, and she was yelling at me terrified as she had driven to my hotel, and I wasn't answering, and the front desk said that they hadn't seen me either. I described where I was, and she talked to the lady that let me stay there and figured out where I was to come and pick me up. Before I left, the lady told me that I was brave, and I was also lucky to have escaped. And then in Spanish, she said something about them not being so forgiving. From there, Daniela insisted that I stay with them at their place, and I agreed. It sucked that I was going to lose money, but the guy knew where I was staying, and I didn't like that thought. So, we went up to my room together to get my stuff, and then went back to her place. The whole time, I kept apologizing, because I felt like I had cut her birthday fun short for being so naive. But she laughed and said that, other than being scared that she may have gotten me kidnapped, that was the most fun she'd had in a while. She told me about the scary side of Venezuela, and how there had been abductions, so she was surprised that they let me go, and couldn't really make sense of it, but we tried not to dwell on it. We decided to keep it to ourselves because we didn't want any of our parents to be afraid or not want us to do anything like this, but we also did not take it lightly. For the rest of the week that I was there, I never traveled alone. I was always with someone that I trusted, or made sure that there were plenty of people around. Plus, I got some pepper spray to at least give me a fighting chance. Thankfully, the rest of the trip was still a lot of fun, and no more really risky situations. I've gone back once since then, and Daniela has also stayed with me in the States, and she had a blast as well. We just know that when you travel somewhere you're not familiar with, anything could happen. So just stay safe. Especially whenever you're traveling alone. This happened when I went to visit my sister, Alexa, and her husband in Texas. My family had always lived in Colorado, but any chance that she got, Alexa could be found outside, exploring and always on the move. So, the first chance she got after high school, she started moving around to better see the country, I suppose. She ended up meeting her husband, Edgar, when she lived in Utah, and they moved back to Colorado briefly before finally settling in Texas, due to his job. They didn't have kids and didn't plan to, so they still roamed around a lot when they could. She was 3 years older than me, and I always lived vicariously through her. I still lived in Colorado, and the thought of moving to another state was kind of nerve-wracking to me, but watching her was good enough for me, especially when she would invite me over to at least see the area and try to convince me to move as well. So, one year my boyfriend at the time, JP, and I decided we would take a vacation down to Texas and stay with them for a few days. It was my 5th anniversary with the company that I worked for, which gave me an extra week of vacation. I was itching to use it before the end of the year, like I usually did, and I wanted to actually go somewhere and do something. Alexa invited us to stay with them and offered to pick us up from the airport if we flew, which would save us a lot on a hotel and gas, so hell yeah, we took the offer. JP had actually been to parts of Texas a few times, so I was the only one that had never been. I was excited and nervous about it all at the same time. The flight was fine. There was mild turbulence, but it was fine otherwise. Airplanes make me nervous. Like I said, I'm kind of a wimp. I hadn't seen Alexa since Christmas, which was nearly 6 months prior, so it was no surprise when we flipped our lids in the airport. We got back to her place and she showed us to the spare bedroom and then walked us around the rest of their home. It was gorgeous. They had a huge fenced-in backyard with a garden full of produce, and she even made salads with the stuff that she had grown. And her dog, Ray, which she had brought with her for Christmas, he was a cute little corgi with a lot of energy. We sat and chatted for a while, and I helped her prep dinner while we waited for Edgar to get off work. We flew out on a Friday, so we would be able to spend time with them over the weekend, while he was off. And Alexa took the week off as well, so we weren't sitting around with nothing to do. We had a cookout and sat out on their back patio, just having a good time and talking and reminiscing. We then got on the topic of camping, and they suggested that we should do it over the weekend. We weren't expecting this, so of course we didn't have any camping supplies like a tent or sleeping bag. However, they were set on this idea, and while they had an extra tent, we went and bought some other equipment so that we were prepared. So after we got back from shopping, we stayed at their place that night since it was already late, and then started packing stuff for a camping excursion. We got the tents and sleeping stuff put together, and then we packed a couple of coolers with food and drinks so that we wouldn't run out while we were there. The reason they wanted to pack so much was because it wasn't going to be a quick trip back to the city if we forgot something. We were going to be staying in the very south parts of Texas, like close to the border. She said that at night it gets really dark and quiet, and there's rarely anyone around to intrude, so it's a beautiful place to get away. However, it also tends to get cooler, so they warned us to be prepared for that. Otherwise, we got all packed up and took Edgar's truck out there. He had a bench seat in the back, so we could all sit in there and have our stuff in the bed. It was perfect. So when we got there, she was absolutely right. There were trucks every once in a while where people were patrolling. We saw some guy on a bike with a huge tub-like thing on the back that he was putting trash in. He was picking stuff up, which was pretty cool. But to my surprise, people really did leave us alone. We got the tents set up and then made a fire since it was going to get cold, and just kicked back again, talking and having a good time. The guys were constantly trying to one-up themselves, doing push-ups and backflips, so Alexa and I were cracking up, making fun of them. Everything was great until we had a van pull up, and 3 guys got out of it. I was a little nervous because I had asked my sister if we would be trespassing, and she said no and that people do this all the time. I know it doesn't make it right, but I trusted her and didn't have any reason to think otherwise. The guys stopped and stood up, dusting themselves off and looking over at them. As 2 of them approached, I could tell as they got closer that they were in camo, but it was the digital stuff, so they were out in the desert-looking area with no green to hide in, as is, but it wasn't the natural-looking stuff. I was already a little nervous, but when Edgar went to welcome them, the guy immediately yelled at him to shut up and not move. He then asked us what we were doing there, and my sister tried explaining that we were just camping. That's when the first guy waved the second guy over, and we noticed he was holding a gun and started walking over to the guys. JP started saying something when the guy raised the gun to his face, telling him to shut up again. At this point, I'm freaking out internally and looked over at my sister to gauge her reaction, and the fact that she looked just as terrified did not bode well for me. The first guy told us we weren't allowed to be there, and they made the two guys get on the ground and started restraining them with something other than handcuffs. Then, the first guy made Alexa and I stand up and had us lean against Edgar's truck. He said we would all have to go with him to make a report and asked us if we had anything illegal on us. We said no. He then started patting us down, but it wasn't a normal pat down. He was very aggressive, and he seemed to linger when he was touching our hips and our thighs. I then saw that he got close to my sister's face and whispered something. When he pulled back, she looked over towards me, and I could see that she was about to start crying. He then yelled over to the second man to have them stand up, saying he would be waiting here with him and that we would be going back with him for a strip search since we could be smugglers. The third guy that was standing by the van then came to us and started pulling us over to get in. This is when my sister started pleading with them, saying we weren't here to do anything other than camping, and promised to leave if they would just let us go now. All I could do was nod in agreement, as I choked back tears myself. But the guy wasn't having it, and he started threatening to shoot us if we didn't shut up. As we were stalling to get into the van, the first guy was going through our coolers, and we noticed some lights approaching in front of us. They seemed to slow down as they curved around the area that we were in, and the third guy that was with us started waving at the car. I was beginning to worry it was someone else that was with them and that we were screwed for sure. But then Edgar started yelling out to them. It made the guy that was with them start to look out frantically, as he didn't know what to do and looked over to the first two guys, who were now standing and looking at the strange car, and then back to Edgar. He then started walking swiftly but calmly towards the van, saying, "Let's go." And the second guy started running over to him. The guy with us said something to the effect of, "Watch what you tell people," pushing us back. They all got in the van and drove off. The car that we saw had stopped, and the van slowed down as they passed, and then they sped away. Once they were out of view, we ran over to the guys since they still had their hands behind them, but they had them out by the time that we got there. They had only tied them in a knot with what looked like shoestring, so it wasn't very good or sturdy, thankfully. Then the person in the car got out and came over to us. It was an older man in a cowboy hat, and he asked us what was going on and if we were okay. We all frantically started explaining what happened, and the man ran back to his car where he said his phone was and he called for help. After he got off the phone with them, he explained that he was a retired cop, and he liked to drive out here as well and watch the sunset, and that he had seen plenty of people doing the same thing as us. But he said that he felt something was off when he saw the van and the man standing with JP and Edgar, so he decided to stop. I could not thank that guy enough either. When the police showed up and we explained everything, they didn't really seem shocked by any of this. I know they're probably trained to not really show expression, but it was just a terrifying situation for us. They seemed like it was just another day. But when Edgar started to become upset about the whole thing, they finally told us this wasn't the first time they've had this reported. They've been telling people not to do this, apparently for this exact reason. But of course, some people don't listen, and some others, like my sister and Edgar, hadn't heard anything about it. So they took our report and suggested that we leave in case they come back, and we did not hesitate. We drove back almost in silence to their place, with Edgar trying to lighten up the mood, and then we all went to bed. I tried asking Alexa what the guy said to her, but she refused to acknowledge the question, or just wouldn't tell me. I didn't push it beyond that, because obviously it was terrifying. The next day was a bit awkward, but we quickly pushed forward so that we could still have a good time. We ended up going to an arcade-style bar thing that weekend, and then just hung out at their place. And the rest of the week was still fun as well, and by the end of it, we had put it behind us. They tried apologizing when we left, but hell, it's not like they expected any of this to happen. The bad part is, they never found or caught the guys either. I just hope that they were never successful in getting someone into that van. So that was today's video. A collection of vacation-based stories. Fantastic stories. Two very creepy and very long stories. Hopefully you guys didn't mind that it was only 2 instead of more than that. But just genuinely freaky. So, huge thank you to those that submitted the stories and those that let me use their stories on Reddit. You guys are all amazing. Thank you so very much. And thank you, dear listener, for getting to this point in the video. Because, alternatively, you could have just gone and clicked away. You could have clicked a different video. Could have gone and watched the latest cringe compilation. But you didn't. So thank you. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider hitting that thumbs up button, and you can also subscribe to the channel if you're new. Leave me a comment down below for the purpose of making the robot lords happy, telling me what you thought of the video, what you think of me as a person, how you're doing, just stuff like that. But yeah. Anyways, I hope you all have a great day, and I hope I see you on the next video. But of course, all of my beautiful friends, until that moment is upon us, sleep well.